Chapter 40. Sophie had hoped that, thanks to her enhanced concentration, maybe this would be the year she finally wouldn't be a disaster in PE. But after hours of flying with Sylvanie and using muscles she hadn't known existed, even walking felt like a tremendous effort. At least she'd figured out how to steer Sylvanie by teaching her simple commands like left and right, and if you dump me into another pile of sparkly manure, I will clobber you. But the council expected her to whisk into the sanctuary on Sylvanie's back, circle the crowd a few times, and then land in the center of the counselors. And Sylvanie still bucked and thrashed whenever anyone besides Sophie got too close to her. Sorry, guys, hold on. Between the bruises from getting thrown from the back of a terrified alicorn and an entire morning of stumbling and falling because her tired muscles couldn't keep up with the other prodigies, Sophie finally swallowed her pride. She skipped the cafeteria and used her lunch break to visit the healing center. "What is that?" she asked, pointing at the picture of her hanging above the bed she was currently sitting on. Or more accurately, the picture of her in her humiliating mastodon costume in the middle of an awkward dance step at the opening ceremonies. Elwyn snort laughed. "Figured this year I should pay you proper tribute. Just be glad I didn't take Keith's suggestion and rename this place the Foster Center." Sandor laughed from his spot in the corner, and Sophie glared at both of them. But it was hard to stay mad after Elwyn handed her a vial of achy break, and the cooling serum rushed through her muscles and made the pain go away. She'd just have to steal that photo later. "You seem like you're sleeping better," Elwyn said, studying her face. "Glad to see that. I was afraid you might be worse. What with..." Sophie stared at her hands. She shouldn't be sleeping so soundly. She should be working around the clock to try to find another clue to get the truth about the Black Swan. But she couldn't block Sylvanie's transmissions, and the alicorn's emotions were so irresistibly soothing. No matter how hard she fought to stay awake, sleep always pulled her under, and it was such a relief to have sweet, happy dreams after so many weeks of nightmares. But she was letting Alden down. Every second she wasted was a second she left him trapped in the darkness. "Hey," Elwyn said, jostling her shoulder. "You're not giving in to any guilt, right?" She shook her head, trying not to shiver at the reminder. "Good, keep it that way, but still." He snapped his fingers, flashing a bright yellow orb around her face. The bright light hit her eyes, and pain exploded in her mind. Sorry, my cat's playing with the toy car. "Kitty, where is it? Where's your car? Where's the car?" Oh, sorry, guys. Where am I? Oh. The bright light hit her eyes and pain exploded in her mind. "What's wrong?" Elwyn asked, but all she could do was curl up in a ball and focus on breathing. Something wet touched her lips, and she readily swallowed the sweet serum, not even caring if it was a sedative. She just wanted the pain to stop. Fortunately, it did. She took several more breaths before she chanced opening her eyes. "Thank goodness," Elwyn said as he wiped the sweat off her brow. "Do you have any idea what you just put me through?" "Sorry, that migraine came out of nowhere." "It was more than a migraine," Tiergan said, and Sophie turned her head, surprised to see him there. Elwyn sent... Hold on. Kitty, where's your car? Kitty, where is it? What are you playing with? "Elwyn sent Sandor to get me when you wouldn't wake up. Do you remember anything about the last hour?" "Hour?" She had no idea the pain lasted that long. "Do you really not remember me calling your name or shaking your shoulders or trying to get you to swallow different elixirs?" "I guess I blacked out." But she didn't remember blacking out. She thought she'd been awake. Elwyn ran his hands through his already mussed hair. "Do you see any problems, Tiergan? Because I can't find anything physically wrong." Tiergan squinted at Sophie and shook his head. "I can't get past her blocking, but I assume that's a good sign." "A good sign for what?" Sophie asked, not sure if she wanted to know the answer. "If your mind were..." Tiergan shook his head like he couldn't say it. "I think I would be able to slip through the cracks, but your thoughts are as silent as ever." Sophie pulled herself up, moving her head different ways, checking for any remnant of the pain. I feel fine now. I think it's just all the stress. It's been a rough few days. No one could argue with that, and she was relieved, even though her stomach was churning and her heart was racing and her brain kept remembering all the times the light had affected her weirdly. She'd gotten better for a few days, but it seemed worse than ever now. Oh my gosh. Hold on, guys. Where is it? Here, honey. Here's your car. Sophie pulled herself up, moving her head different ways, checking for any remnant of the pain. I feel fine now. I think it's just all the stress. It's been a rough few days. No one could argue with that, and she was relieved, even though her stomach was churning and her heart was racing, and her brain kept remembering all the times the light had affected her weirdly. She'd gotten better for a few days, but it seemed worse than ever now. But if Elwyn and Tyrgen didn't see anything wrong, she had to believe that she was fine. She couldn't worry about one more thing. I think you should go home and rest, Sandor suggested. If I go home early, Grady and Edeline will worry, and they're dealing with enough right now. I'm fine, really. Sophie stood up to prove it. How hard is it to sit through an hour of study hall? Sandor's glare didn't falter, but Elwyn nodded. I guess you can rest here until the end of the session, but you're going to rest, and I'm going to check a few more things as you do. Deal. I don't like this, Sandor grumbled. Everyone ignored him. Tyrgen excused himself, promising to see Sophie on Thursday and ordering her to hail him if she needed anything. She nodded as she lay back down on the cot and closed her eyes, ignoring the sound of Elwyn's fingers snapping. She used the time to try and think of a plan for helping Alden. Her only possible lead was her old journal, but she had no idea what happened to it. The elves wouldn't have left any trace of her existence for humans to find. Would they have destroyed the things she left, or brought them back to the lost cities? She really hoped it was the latter, but she wasn't sure how to find out. Usually she went to Alden with those kinds of questions. Who else would know? The counselors would, but she couldn't exactly hail them on her imparter and ask for a favor, could she? She still hadn't come up with any answer when the bells chimed the end of session. Sandor tried one last time to convince her to go home, but Sophie thanked Elwyn, promised she would call him if she felt even the slightest headache, and headed to study hall in the glass pyramid. Dex waved her over to the table he'd saved. Sophie grinned as she took the chair across from him and got a better look at his hair. It looked like he'd stuck his head out a car window going 90 miles an hour down the freeway. How was ability detecting? So annoying. They were testing to see if we were gusters, so we basically spent 2 hours in a wind tunnel. That explained the hair. She glanced over her shoulder, then leaned back and whispered, You could be taking technopathy instead. Yeah, and be studying the stupidest ability ever, he whispered back. It's not stupid. It's awesome. Have you at least told your parents? No, my dad would tell everyone, trying to prove that his son's not talentless like he is. Or maybe because he'd be proud of you. It's an amazing ability. Yeah, right. I can play with gadgets. Who cares? I do. That iPod trick you set up for me was so cool. I never thanked you for that, by the way. Dex's cheeks turned bright pink. Oh, are we making Dex blush? Marilla asked as she grabbed the seat next to Dex. That's one of my favorite games. Mine too, Keith said, snatching the seat on the other side of Sophie, though it's also fun making Foster blush. Sophie felt her face get hot, and he smirked at her. See? Mr. Sensen, Sir Rosings, the mentor monitoring study hall, called, slamming his skinny arm on his desk. Would you like me to extend your detention? Tempting, but I think I'll pass. The room erupted, and the giggles as Sir Rosings glared at Keith. Or Sophie assumed he was glaring. It was hard to tell. He had the kind of face that looked like he'd just licked a lemon. Shouldn't you be sitting with the level 5s? Dex hissed as Jency dragged over a chair. Nah, somebody had to keep Foster company. Keith scooted his chair closer to Sophie's, earning himself an eye roll from Dex, and pulled out one of his textbooks, flipping through the pages so quickly Sophie doubted he was reading them. He may have had a photographic memory, but even she couldn't learn that fast. Hey, Keith whispered, nudging Sophie with his arm bent, but keeping his eyes glued to his book. Do you know what's going on with Alden? Have you talked to Fritz? Sorry. He isn't answering his imparter. Oh, yeah, he's got a lot going on. Oh, come on, Foster, don't hold out on me. Every time anything weird happens, you're always involved. Sophie knew he was joking, but there was a touch of truth to his words. Keith must have felt her mood shift because he turned toward her. Everything's okay, right? Sophie bit her lip. I think Fitz should be the one to tell you. That's another day of detention, Mr. Sensen, Sir Rosing shouted. And one for you, Miss Foster. Ooh, we can be detention buddies again, Keith said as Sophie shot him a death glare and went back to her homework. But she couldn't stop thinking about Fitz. He was home, mourning his father, and she hadn't even checked on him, or Bianna. She felt queasy just thinking about it, but she was their friend, and she couldn't keep avoiding them just because she was afraid of what they might say. They needed her now more than ever.